Is free speech in danger in America? Sarah McLaughlin is a senior scholar at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, which is a free speech advocacy organization, and she's also the author of the book Authoritarians in the Academy, which is about China's attempts to politicize and suppress free speech in American universities and across the world. And Sarah joins us for a pair of episodes about free speech. In the first episode, part 1, we will be talking about her book, Authoritarians in the Academy, about China's attempts to suppress the free speech of students, the free speech of professors, the free speech of guest speakers at universities, and how they use different organizations and fronts to do this, how universities respond, some responding pretty well, some basically folding in the response of Chinese pressure. We talk about all of that in this episode that you're listening to right now, part 1. Tomorrow, we will also be releasing a part 2, where Sarah joins the podcast to talk about some more recent threats to free speech. The firing of Jimmy Kimmel after pressure from the Trump administration. Pam Bondi, who is Trump's attorney general, saying that hate speech is no longer legal. And many, many other instances that have called into question whether or not free speech still exists in America under the Trump administration. Those issues will be discussed in part 2 of our episode with Sarah McLaughlin, so please be sure to check that out. As always, thank you for listening to the podcast. If you want to support us, share on social media, recommend it to a friend, all of that is great. But the best way to support us is by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Join a local chapter, make a difference in your community, get access to swag, stickers, bonus episodes of the podcast, all of that, and really help support the mission that CNL has. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting Center for New Liberalism, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm Jeremiah Johnson, your host, and today we are joined by Sarah McLaughlin, author of the new book, Authoritarians in the Academy. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I think the first thing we should do here is kind of set the ground level of what's happening and why it's happening before we get into kind of all the details. From a high-level view, this is a book about how authoritarian countries are trying to set policies, essentially set speech policies at universities around the world that are not their own universities. That's universities in America, Australia, Europe, many different places. And the book is about many countries, but it's mostly about China, that the Chinese government has set basically a goal of restricting criticism of China in many, many places around the world. And they've got a bunch of tactics to do this that I'm sure we're going to get into. But I guess from a high level, there are two questions that I'd love to start with. Number one, why is this so existentially important for the Chinese government that they are trying to extend their reach all the way across the world into universities in America and Europe? And when did this effort really start with kind of a serious, attempt to restrict people's speech outside of China?
Yeah, so the Chinese government puts a lot of stock into its perception around the world and how it's seen and how it's perceived and how people discuss it in places from art galleries to newspapers to television shows. And so there's a concerted effort on the part of the Chinese government to have that control. It's almost like they want to be able to apply what they do within their own borders and their stranglehold over speech within their borders to a global scale. And so I think we're seeing that in every industry that you can imagine. Even the NBA, even fashion houses are not exempt from this pressure. But what made me want to write this book is that I think it matters even more when we see these things in higher education because it worries me for a lot of reasons. To see this kind of pressure applied in industries more broadly. But we rely on higher education for very important things. Put simply, higher ed is the lens through which we see and understand the world and the way it works. So when we have this kind of pressure within higher ed, it really limits or can fundamentally alter how we understand the world we live in and what the Chinese government's role is in it. And I think you can probably look to the early 90s to see when this started. It was just beginning. In the early 90s, Chinese consulates in the US started using their power and pressure to encourage universities not to host speakers that they didn't like. How much you want to say it was gentle encouragement versus implied threats is up for discussion. But that's when consular officials started reaching out to universities like MIT and saying, why are you hosting the Dalai Lama? This is not a good speaker for your university. You should invite people that give the correct impression. And so that's when things started. And that form of pressure, the consular pressure, has vastly increased in a lot of different ways. And that's what I write about in the book, all the ways that we see this pressure exerted within higher ed.
I think it's an interesting point that this happens in all sorts of industries, and the book touches on it a little bit. There's famously Daryl Morey, who it was an NBA general manager who tweeted, I think in support of Hong Kong, and the NBA faced like huge repercussions for that. And, there's I don't know, like movie studios that will edit their films to not be offensive to Chinese sensibilities or to not hurt the feelings, which is a phrase that comes up over and over and over. It must be like a particular idiom in the Chinese language because it doesn't really make sense in English to me, like to say that hurt the feelings of the Chinese people.
Not to get us off track, but I actually just saw this week that Dave Franco's new horror movie, what's it called? Is it Together? I saw that they used AI in China to alter two of the characters to not be gay. They changed one of the characters into a woman, so one of the couples in it would not be gay, which is sort of fascinating to see.
Wow.
The new ways AI is being used, but back to the subject.
That is actually crazy. That's just entirely make an actor into an actress. That is pretty wild. But all of that is something that I think people know, and people can be troubled about that. But I do agree it's different in a sense that like it's potentially a little bit more legitimate if a company is just like, look, we sell widgets and I don't particularly care about politics. I'm just going to do whatever I need to do to sell widgets in China and the US and anywhere else. Like, I'm a widget maker. Don't ask me about the other stuff. Maybe I disagree with that. I'm a very political person, but I can see there's some sort of legitimate argument there. But universities do feel different. Universities are supposed to be homes of free speech and free inquiry, and this is the life of the life of the mind. It's a place where ideas are sacrosanct, right? And if we lose that feels a lot scarier.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the universities, they have been not just, the center of how we understand the world through research, through teaching, but also they have long been known, not just in the US, but globally as hotbeds of political activism. And so that's where a lot of political movements begin, where a lot of activism begins. And so it's not just about what we learn and teach and research, though those things are important. It's also about how political movements begin. And, a lot of powerful movements have begun there. And so the idea that there's this kind of censorship or pressure is it's worrying on a lot of fronts, I think.
Yeah, and you can make a broader case that the society's values are kind of instilled at the university that, for better or worse, all of our elites go to university. I think something like 98% of the members of Congress in the US have university degrees, despite the fact that I think a minority of American adults do. It's like 40% maybe. But like the elite of a country goes to universities. They usually go to very elite universities. And that's where they are instilled with like, what kind of society do we run? What kind of things do we value? And so if we are bending to authoritarian impulses rather than standing up for free speech at these universities, what is that telling the next generation of leadership in this country is something I worry about. But let's get out of the abstract and let's get into details. This is obviously something you've covered, and there's dozens of examples in the book, but I'm wondering if you can highlight a couple of them, a couple particularly egregious examples to kind of showcase what we're talking about here when we say like the Chinese government and other governments as well, but mostly China. They are just attempting to interfere with what goes on at American universities. They are attempting to stifle criticism. Are there any like go-to examples you have here that really make the case?
Yeah, so one of the things I especially focus on in the book is the plight of international students in the United States who are from countries like China and who come to the United States expecting that they'll be able to participate in the free expression and the rights that we're so proud of here in the U.S. And these students have sometimes found that when they've come here, they've left China, but China hasn't necessarily left them. And so the Chinese government has effectively followed them, whether it's through surveillance, whether it's through threats. They have found that speaking freely on campus has had really severe consequences for them and their families because government officials keep watching them when they're here. It's not like they get here and they're on their own. So there's a student who's at Georgetown Law. His name was Jinrei, and he participated in some protests in China or on his campus in response to the COVID-0 protests that were taking place in China a few years ago, responding to the really restrictive rules within the country during COVID. And just because he did that, his family, his parents were visited by police. They had a follow-up visit by party members, and they were threatened. And they had to call him and tell him that if he didn't shut up, there were going to be consequences for his parents. And the student Jinrei, he told me that he doesn't think he'll be able to return home. So these are the severe consequences that a student can face simply because he holds a sign at a protest. He may be able to never see his family again. Or if he does want to see them again, risk prison just because he wanted to speak freely in the U.S. for a couple of years. And it's not an empty threat. There was a student at the University of Minnesota who, when he returned home to Wuhan, China, he was arrested and sentenced to 6 months in prison because he had posted some tweets here that were critical of the Chinese government. And there are a lot of other students like this, but we don't know exactly how many because they're understandably very afraid to speak out because the risk of speaking out about repression you face is that by doing so, you will intensify that repression and you will bring even more heat on yourself. And so that's one of the ways, one of the more direct, extreme ways that the Chinese government has censored speech on campus among students. There have also been, as I mentioned earlier, efforts by consular officials here in the U.S. to pressure and ply universities to not host speakers that the Chinese government dislikes. Most often, those speakers are Tibetan or Taiwanese or connected to human rights issues that the Chinese government does not want discussed globally. In some cases, they have done this through the influence of Confucius Institutes on campus. And Confucius Institutes, for the most part, have died out on campus in the past few years because there's been a lot of media and congressional pressure on these institutes.
And this is worth getting into a little bit more because I think the network of China-related organizations is worth kind of exploring. It's one thing when you're at a university and some local consular official, calls the president of the university and yells at them because like a Uyghur activist is coming to speak at the university. But it's often not just, an official Chinese government employee, like a consular employee. It's often Chinese students themselves or Chinese student organizations or these kind of supposedly nonpartisan, non-governmental organizations like the Confucius Institute. What happens and how are these different organizations arranged by essentially the Communist Party to pressure individual universities and professors and students?
Well, that's what's been really interesting to see because you asked earlier in the conversation about when did this start? How does it work? And some of the early forms of influence that we were seeing most from Chinese officials have, in some ways, gone quieter. We haven't been seeing as many reports of consular officials calling universities and saying you have to disinvite the speaker. But what we have been seeing take its place is influence and efforts on the part of student groups, specifically the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, to dictate how universities, what speakers they allow and who can speak on campus about the Chinese government. And so these CSSA chapters, there's nothing inherently wrong with a student group that organizes around
And for people who aren't familiar, CSSA would be
the Chinese Students and Scholars Association.
yeah, and so this is just it seems like a voluntary at the first sight of it. It seems like like the university has a Muslim Students Association, it has a Jewish student center, it probably has a Black student center. Sure, there's a Chinese student center.
Yeah,
But it's not quite that.
yeah, it's in theory, there's nothing wrong whatsoever with students organizing around a shared background or values. That's what basically every student group is. But the CSSA chapters have been directly involved in a worrying group of incidents where they have expected university administrators to censor speech that they often cast as hurtful or offensive or biased. And that speech also coincidentally happens to be from people who are criticizing human rights abuses in China. And there's this term I use in the book, sensitivity exploitation, which I think is what we're seeing here. And it's students are making impassioned pleas to administrators using the language of offense and hurt and insensitivity to make the claim that critics of the Chinese government need to be censored and removed from campus. And so I think we're seeing appeals to universities who want to be seen as responsive to student concerns and to students' feelings of being hurt and offended. And they're using that to make an argument that it also needs to be applied to critics of an authoritarian power, which I found to be a really fascinating social dynamic.
And one of the things that I noticed, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's noticed this, it was an interesting dynamic you described because when I could kind of trace this thing in many of the examples that were earlier in kind of the timeline, maybe 2014, 2015, there's a lot of language that's about like, this offends our sensibilities, this is, hurts the feelings of the Chinese people. And again, I get stuck on that phrase because it seems like every single one in like 2015 says it hurts the feelings of the Chinese people. Like that must be a stock phrase in Mandarin or something that just gets translated weirdly. But post 2020, it seems like some memo got sent around, and now most of the time, instead, the language from some of these student groups and from some of these organizations that may just be a front for, frankly, the government itself, use the language of anti-Asian racism. And this is, it basically uses the language of woke. And I think you probably avoided using the term wokeness in your book on purpose, but like it appropriates woke ideas and uses them as a hammer to say you can't criticize the Chinese government because that would be racist. And I think there was a shift, like a deliberate shift in strategy at some point.
What I think was also happening at that time was that was, after COVID pandemic had begun, and there were at the time, a spike in concerns about hate crimes against Asian people who were being retaliated against because of the pandemic. But again, I think that was, an example of using a reasonable concern about, hate crimes against people who are being punished for something they had no control over in a racist fashion, and using that to say, this also extends to criticism of the Chinese government, which to me is a very clearly bad faith use of that issue to apply it to people who, frankly, are also would be victims of anti-Asian racism. And that's, some of the concerns I was hearing from some of these student dissidents I spoke to about this issue. And they said, I am Asian. Why, why are people telling me I can't talk about this issue, that it's somehow offensive? Um, so it was interesting to watch the way these arguments changed. But in some ways, it also ended up hurting a lot of students who wanted to be able to speak about this and felt that they were being targeted as, um, offensive people simply for talking about human rights abuses in China. It's, when you take a step back, it's really absurd.
Now, it's one thing to say, well, we're going to protest a speaker that's come. And to some degree, protest is also part of free speech, right? That
Hmm. Absolutely.
if there's a controversial speaker, whether it's a conservative firebrand or whether it's the Dalai Lama, controversial is in the eye of the beholder sometimes. And so people have a right to protest. But that's one thing is, we're calling for you to not invite this speaker. We're going to protest the speaker. But another thing that's also happening is beyond just, threatening foreign students, protesting speakers, some of this is actually leaking into the classroom, and it's kind of changing what professors are allowed to teach or allowed to say. What can you tell us about that? Like, is this actually something that is impacting the curriculum? It's impacting what students are learning?
In most cases, the academics I've spoken to have been conscious and aware of the desire to not be seen or to not be trading away, um, their academic freedom rights to teach what they think is relevant material on the subject to appease students who might be upset or offended by it. I think the time when this was most at risk of academics changing what they teach for this reason was during the online only education during the early months and years of the pandemic. Um, I was really fascinated at that time watching to see how professors changed their teaching or how they didn't change their teaching because of the risks that online surveillance posed to their students. Because we had students, if you were a professor teaching a Chinese politics class, or Islam in China, you would have students who were logging into Zoom from all around the world. And so you actually had students who were taking your course from countries where the material you're teaching is illegal. And so it created some really fascinating ethical questions for academics about how to approach this. And for the most part, I was seeing professors use what I think was creative means to try to ensure that they weren't self-censoring on these issues. But there were some cases where faculty were saying, this, especially outside the US, I saw it. Faculty were saying, this material is too controversial and could create issues for students who are taking it um, outside our borders, zooming in from China. So I'm going to cut this material from the class. And I think for academics who, outside of the surveillance issue, for academics who are concerned that they'll face complaints from students, perhaps for inviting a Uyghur speaker or for providing teaching materials that contradict the Chinese government's positions on things. I think for the most part, they have tried to stand by their teaching and their values, but it has created pressure on the students who attend that classroom because I think some students who are Chinese and who want to speak openly in class are very fearful that they're going to be recorded by their peers and that those recordings are going to be used against them and could put them in prison someday.
Well, and it's even more than that, in that obviously, if you are a Chinese student studying abroad in America or in the UK or Australia, you are at this point very aware of what Xi Jinping is doing, and you're very aware that speech can get you in trouble. But even beyond that, like remaining neutral is sometimes seen as suspicious as well. And you've documented cases where it really seems like the Chinese government is trying to rally all of the Chinese students and force them to kind of protest things that I don't know, maybe they don't even care about, but it's like forced nationalism in a sense. And if you don't go protest that, the Dalai Lama is speaking on campus, we will view you as suspicious.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. The lack of speech is in some ways just as suspicious as dissenting speech, because if you don't say openly and proudly that you agree with the Chinese government, that isn't really much better than saying you disagree with the Chinese government, because silence is in some ways its own protest. And so I think that was definitely the case. And I have even heard from students that they have been warned that their silence is noted and watched.
Well, silence is violence. That's something I've learned in the last few years. So speech is violence, but also silence is violence. So really just everything these days is violence. So, and that has some real negative consequences, actually.
It does.
We're gonna get like speech and violence are now, there's a large national debate, not to presage part two of this interview, but I want to stick on the book for a little while longer before we get to kind of the many of the national questions around speech that everyone listening should definitely listen to part two of this. In the book, we talk about all these different things where the Chinese government, along with governments like, the Gulf state, the Arabian Peninsula governments, and a few others, are really trying very hard to restrict speech on university campuses around the world. They have a wide variety of tools to do this. They kind of, willingly or not, they kind of draft their, nationals, their foreign exchange students into kind of protesting for them. They have the consulars, they have these Confucius Institutes, the CSSAs. I'm curious how you found university responses in aggregate. And I would especially be curious, when this happens, how do universities respond? And how does that response differ by level? How do students respond when they hear that, the Chinese government may be unhappy with something that's happening? How do professors respond? How do administrators respond?
So, by far, the worst responses have been on the part of university administrators, or the most notable lack of responses have been on their part. There have been times when, many times when universities have not responded to demands that they censor speech. For example, at the University of Chicago, the CSSA chapter there claimed that an invitation to the exiled Hong Kong activist Nathan Law was outside the bounds of free expression. It was an insult to Chinese students to have him on campus. The university obviously did not act there, and University of Chicago is known well for its free speech commitments and principles, and so it's good
Yeah.
to see that.
I think we should actually call out good actors here, because I know that I would be more than happy for you to call out some of the worst actors. But if there are universities that are particularly good on this, like perhaps the University of Chicago, then we should obviously highlight the good ones as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the University of Chicago, they rightfully did not act there. Purdue University is one of the ones that I have seen the strongest statements in response to these issues. There was a very disturbing case there where a student, he was vocal on campus and online specifically about the Tiananmen massacre and about wanting to speak about it, wanting to honor the people who died there, and his peers were threatening to report him to Chinese security. They were, watching things he did, creating records on him to essentially put him in legal trouble. And it did ultimately find him. His parents were questioned. They were told he had to shut up, which a message they passed along to him. And Purdue's president at the time, I believe it was Mitch Daniels, he said that he was not aware this was happening, but it was unacceptable for students to feel that they were not safe or free to criticize a foreign power on campus. That was great to see. And I think what made it so notable was that it's rare, unfortunately. And more often we have seen either just a quiet dismissal of this issue, or in some cases, direct censorship that I think has aided the Chinese government. The worst example I'm aware of, or one of the worst examples, was at George Washington University in 2022. This is one I detail a lot in the book, but there students posted artwork anonymously that was critical of the upcoming Winter Olympics in Beijing. And it was artwork from this Chinese-Australian dissident. It was essentially suggesting that it was wrong to hold games in a country with a series of human rights abuses, which the posters detailed. And the two student groups at the campus, including the CSSA, complained to the university administration and said, you have to do something about these posters. They're offensive and hurtful, and they're going to spur racism against Asian students. And the president at the time at GW he replied and said that he was personally offended by the posters, and that he was going to not only remove them, but take action to investigate who posted them. And I want to preface this by saying that in response to criticism, he backtracked. He had admitted he made a mistake. But the problem to me is that was his first instinct. I don't know if he even saw the posters, but he immediately agreed that they were offensive, that it was offensive to depict human rights abuses that the Chinese government was committing, but also that he was going to use university resources to unmask anonymous critics of the Chinese government. It's just an incredible, shocking thing that an American university...
In effect, he was going to become an arm of the Chinese surveillance state, of the Chinese secret police.
Exactly.
He was going to do their work for them. That's astonishing.
Yeah, it was going to be American college campus police used to further the censorship mission of the Chinese government. And, I think sometimes people scoff a little bit about, campus free speech issues, and they say, oh, it's not a big deal. I assure you, it's a very big deal if you're a student who gets this on their disciplinary record, that they were investigated and punished for posting criticisms of the Chinese government. And it turned out that's exactly what GW was risking. Some of those students were actually international students from China and Hong Kong, and had that then put on their disciplinary record, those students could risk imprisonment just for that. And so, there's a real carelessness. I think, GW probably thought, oh, we're going to look good here. We're responding assertively in response to student complaints of hurtful, offensive speech on campus. That's not what they did. They actually risked putting their own students in really severe legal peril. And that kind of carelessness is really incredible. I think universities have a duty to these students, and it's certainly not something that was on display here.
The book goes into many, many different kind of instances of this where administrations have folded essentially in the face of pressure from China. They have canceled events with speakers. They have, tried to interfere with what professors were teaching or interfere with curriculums. They have warned off students about talking about certain things. And we could spend the whole hour here going through just example after example after example. But I think a better use of time is to just think about why. Why would the university, the symbol of free expression and free inquiry and the power of debating different ideas, why would they so readily go along with this. Like, one of the phrases you used was that you find it disturbing that George Washington University's president, that his first instinct was to agree and say, yes, yes, oh, this is so offensive. It's terrible and unacceptable, and we're going to find who did it and punish them. And he later backed down, but his first instinct was to do that. Why?
So there's a few different reasons. But I won't lie that I think the primary one is ultimately financial. And there are a few different ways that the financial question is in play here. There's, been a lot of discussion about international students in the U.S. In recent months, and particularly because of suggestions on the part of the Trump administration that they're going to limit universities' access to international students. And the reason why that's such a big deal is because that universities really rely on these students. They tend to pay more in tuition than their American counterparts. Some universities can have 30 to 40% of their students are international. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. In theory, there's a lot of value that comes to students from being, dorming with and talking with people from different countries. That's a great way to learn about the world around you. But universities have really come to rely on these students as a important part of their financial picture. And so there's a few reasons why they might act differently to protect access to the students. The first is if you get, a letter from a student group saying, we're going to tell, and this is something that the Chicago students suggested, we're going to tell Chinese students that this is not a campus that's welcoming to them because Nathan Law is speaking here. You're going to feel a little bit of pressure to say, okay, what can I do to make sure I still have access to these students and that they don't decide to boycott us over the speaker. And there's also the threats that the Chinese government can issue about access to these students. There was actually a Canadian university about a decade or so ago that the Chinese government de-recognized diplomas from that university to retaliate against them for hosting the Dalai Lama. And so obviously their international students from China were going to leave, and they were not going to be getting more students from that country. And so that's a really severe threat hanging over the heads of universities because you need to keep access to these students for financial reasons. And then, not even on the student side, but just more broadly, there are a lot of financial reasons why universities want to maintain their ties to China, whether it's through research agreements or partnerships, joint institutes, satellite campuses. It's a good way for universities to seek out more funding, which they're always searching for as they become, these kind of massive institutions. And so they're going to feel perhaps, this implicit pressure to ensure that they're not offending their partner. And there's actually a great example of this. When NC State disinvited the Dalai Lama, I think it was 2009, they admitted that it was because they wanted to protect the university's relationship with China. And so, the financial pressures are really overpowering. And beyond that, there's a lot of benefit to being global institutions. And I think you have a greater chance of success being a global institution when you play nice with the Chinese government. And that's just how it is.
The financial thing is obviously huge. But another idea that you kind of tackle in the book is that there were previous signs that universities were already kind of becoming less friendly to free speech before China's authoritarianism really reared its head, that this was something that was being set up, so to speak, that they were primed for kind of this kind of challenge. Can you talk a little bit about why you think that? Why did you see signs even before China started doing this really heavy-handed stuff that universities were already slipping in their role as guardians of free speech?
Yeah, well, I've been at FIRE for a long time now, and you could look at hundreds and hundreds of cases where you could see that students and faculty have been targeted for engaging in unpopular, controversial, hurtful, subjectively hurtful speech. And so that's nothing new. And I think it's one of the factors that has been exacerbating this, because it's easier for people to expect universities to censor speech that they subjectively don't like about China if universities already can be relied on to respond when there are complaints about offensive speech. And that's
Hmm.
obviously been, a big issue here in the US in the past decade or so.
We've had some, I think, very very good reckonings with, are certain kind of things hurtful? Should we reevaluate the way that we talk about certain subjects? And I think in some cases that's good and deserved, over the past 10 years. But I also think there's a distinction between should we approve of them morally and should they be legal?
Absolutely.
Should it be actually illegal to talk about certain things in a certain way? And speech can hurt someone. The phrase hurtful is really interesting because to some degree, I think the principal thing is to say, I don't care if it hurts you. It's still free speech. If it's hurtful, yeah, I'm sorry you got hurt. I'm going to keep doing it. Like the principal thing is just to say, I don't care about your offense or your hurt, you know?
Yeah, and I think there are two different ways to address it. There's the question of how do we, wisely or not, socially pressure each other to create different norms around what kind of speech is morally and socially acceptable. But it's long been the legal understanding in the United States, upheld by the Supreme Court, that um, we do not allow the government to create the rules around what's hurtful or not. And I think there have been a lot of examples in the past week that show that if the government gets to decide what's hurtful and mean, the government is probably going to use that definition to further its own ends. And so the idea here is that, if we want to have, social discussions about what's appropriate, that's not going to determine the law. The law cannot be based around subjective feelings at the time. And with public universities, they are actually bound by the First Amendment. And so, whether something is hurtful or not is completely irrelevant to the question of whether it's protected on a public university campus. And so we've obviously been seeing a lot of debates and discussion and focus on that as it's been at the center of a lot of media attention in recent years.
One more question before we kind of shift gears, and for everyone listening, there is going to be a part 2 to this episode. It's going to address a lot of the threats to free speech that have been taking place just in the last week from the Trump administration. But before we get into that, I want to ask one more question here about the book. And again, for everyone, the book is called Authoritarians in the Academy: How the Internationalization of Higher Education and Borderless Censorship Threaten Free Speech. You can buy it wherever books are sold. The author is Sarah McLaughlin, who we've been talking to today. My final question here is, what can we ultimately do about this? Because the pessimist in me says, look, ultimately, there is, we can stand up for the ideals that we want, but we can't actually, in the case of foreign students, we can't guarantee their safety. We can say, you come to America, you can say whatever you want. This is a free speech zone and we will stand up for you at this university. It's not going to stop their families from being harassed. It's not going to stop them from being thrown in jail if they go back home. It's not going to, we may end up losing business, and maybe that's the principal thing to do, is just to reject that money if it comes with strings attached. But ultimately, some of this feels a little bit like we just have to accept that, well, for foreign students, they're just not going to have free speech because China can punish them and we can't really change that. Is that too pessimistic of a view?
I don't think it's fully too pessimistic. So there are some basic realities here, as you say. We cannot change what the Chinese government does. That it's not something that we have control over. We can't force, the machinery of the CCP to, end human rights abuses. But there are things that we can do here on the U.S. side where we can at least start to mitigate those effects. And I like one thing you said earlier about trying to draw attention to good actors, because that's what we want to see more of. And if, giving praise to people who have done it is a good way to ensure we see more universities acknowledge and react to this, I'm happy to do that. Um, but there are a few things universities can do. Be aware of what challenges your international students face. Some of the students I've spoken to have told me they don't even alert their university when they have been facing threats or harassment because they're afraid that their universities will choose their partnerships with China over their students. So there are things universities can do to be clear that they will never pick, a $1.5 million grant over their students' rights. They can also do more to educate their students about how they can speak freely here in the U.S. and what their rights are and how they can protect themselves. I think there's probably a really good opportunity here for universities to help students make sure they understand the best ways to speak anonymously on the internet, because a lot of the speech that's going to be getting these students in trouble here is going to be things they say online. So doing what you can to make sure they understand, basic data protection here, that's a good place to start. And they can also, look at their partnerships abroad and make sure they're not part of some kind of agreement that is terrible for academic freedom and free expression. And by starting to extricate themselves from partnerships and agreements that violate basic free speech rules, I think they can send a message to their students that they're not going to, be ignored or denied if they alert their university to censorship they're facing.
Hopefully we can make some of this happen. Hopefully that, we can have people in positions of power at these universities, administrators who believe in the university's mission and ideals more than they believe in the bottom line. One more time for everybody who's listening, the book is Authoritarians in the Academy by Sarah McLaughlin. Check it out. It's a fantastic book. And in part 2 of this, Sarah will be joining us to talk about recent actions in the wake of Charlie Kirk's death that, are we facing free speech threats here at home? So thank you everyone for listening, and we'll catch you at the next one.